how she lived, and more importantly, you have to understand what she was up against from the very first day she walked through those palace doors. Diana was 19 years old when the world fell in love with her. 19. Think about that for a moment. She was barely an adult. She was shy. She worked at a kindergarten. She blushed when cameras caught her off guard. And yet, she was chosen, selected almost clinically, to become the wife of the heir to the British throne. Prince Charles was 32. He had already loved someone else for years, a woman named Camilla Parker Bowles. Everyone in the royal circle knew it. The courtiers knew it. The Queen Mother knew it. And eventually, Diana would know it too. But in the beginning, she knew nothing of what was coming. She stood on the steps of St. Paul's Cathedral on July 29, 1981, in that extraordinary silk taffeta gown with a 25-foot train, and she smiled at a world that was completely aides and staff and members of the press pack, who watched Charles's face darken whenever the crowd erupted for Diana. One aide described a moment where Charles muttered under his breath, "Why do they only want her?" Diana noticed, and it broke something between them. She began to understand that she hadn't married a man who loved her. She had married an institution that needed her, and now that same institution was watching her, cataloging her, waiting for her to make a mistake. She started making them, not out of stupidity, but out of pain. She developed bulimia. She threw herself down a staircase while pregnant. She cut herself with a penknife in moments of absolute despair. These were not the actions of a woman living a fairy tale. These were the actions of a woman who was drowning and screaming for help in the only ways she knew how. And the palace looked away. Here is where the story takes its first dark turn. Because what most people don't realize is that Diana didn't just suffer quietly. She began to fight back. She cultivated relationships with journalists. She whispered things into the right ears. She cooperated secretly with Andrew Morton, a royal journalist who was writing what would become the most explosive book ever published about the British royal family. They communicated through an intermediary. Diana recorded herself, alone in a room, answering Morton's questions on cassette tape. Her voice on those recordings is extraordinary. Calm, controlled, heartbreaking, and absolutely fearless. She talks about the loneliness, the bulimia, Charles and Camilla, the way the palace tried to silence her, the way she felt like a prisoner inside her own life. And then she says something that stops you cold. She says, "I was the separated wife of the Prince of Wales. I was a problem. I was a liability, and I knew that I was not going to be allowed to go quietly. Not going to be allowed." Those words sat at the back of the world's mind for years after she said them. And then she died, and suddenly, those words meant something else entirely. Diana. Her true story was published in June 1992. The royal family was not prepared for it. The book didn't just pull back the curtain on an unhappy marriage. It detonated it. It described in painful detail the coldness of Prince Charles, his ongoing relationship with Camilla, and the way the palace had failed Diana at every turn. The Queen was reportedly furious. Charles was humiliated. And Diana sold 2 million copies in the first year. The public adored her for it. But inside the palace walls, something shifted. The gloves came off. The war between Diana and the royal family stopped being private and became something far more vicious. By the end of 1992, Charles and Diana had separated officially, but separation wasn't the same as freedom. Not for Diana. Not in a world where the palace controlled the press, managed the narrative, and had centuries of experience making inconvenient people disappear quietly. from the public eye. They began to brief against her. Anonymous sources appeared in newspapers, describing Diana as unstable, manipulative, a threat to the monarchy, a woman who couldn't be trusted. Diana recognized the tactic immediately. She told friends, "They're trying to make me look mad, so that when they come for me, nobody will believe what I say." There is something that rarely gets discussed in these conversations, something that sits quietly beneath the surface of the official story. And yet, once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Diana had people watching her, not just the press, not just the public, but people inside the system itself. Former staff members have spoken about cars parked outside her apartment at Kensington Palace, about phone calls that felt like they weren't entirely private, about conversations that seemed to reach ears they were never meant to reach. Diana herself was convinced her phones were tapped. She changed handsets regularly. She used public telephone boxes on occasion, a princess, stepping out into the London street, feeding coins into a payphone because she didn't trust the lines inside her own home. Her close friend Rosa Monckton later confirmed that Diana had spoken to her about the surveillance, that Diana believed she was being monitored not just by the tabloids, but by British intelligence. And here is where it gets complicated, because it wasn't entirely paranoia. In 1998, a year after Diana's death, a former MI5 officer named David Shaler made a series of claims that sent shockwaves through the British establishment. Shaler alleged that MI5 had indeed maintained files on Diana. He alleged that she had been considered in intelligence terms a person of interest, not because she was a criminal, but because of her relationships, her influence, and her increasingly independent political activities. The British government denied everything. Shaler was prosecuted under the Official Secrets Act, but the files were never produced to prove they didn't exist, and in the absence of proof, the questions only grew louder. And then, in November 1995, Diana did something no one expected. She walked into a BBC interview, sat across from journalist Martin Bashir, and for 55 minutes, she told the truth, all of it. The cameras captured her, in close-up, dark eyeliner, pale skin, those eyes, those extraordinary eyes looking straight into the lens. She talked about Charles and Camilla. She said the famous line, "There were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded." She talked about her bulimia, her self-harm, her struggle to be heard. And then she said something that would haunt the years to come. She said, "I'd like to be a queen in people's hearts." And then she paused and she said, "But I don't see myself being queen of this country." 23 million people watched that interview in Britain alone. The palace reacted with barely concealed rage. Within weeks, the Queen wrote to both Charles and Diana personally, and told them to divorce. Not suggested, told. Diana had forced their hand, and they never forgave her for it. What is important to understand, and what the official narrative consistently glosses over, is that the Bashir interview did not just damage the royal family's reputation, it changed Diana. Something happened to her in that chair, in front of those cameras, speaking her truth out loud for the first time to the entire world. She became more certain of herself, more resolved, more willing to use her platform in ways that made the establishment deeply, visibly uncomfortable. In the months that followed, she began taking positions on issues that royals simply did not touch. She visited leprosy patients in Pakistan and held their hands when no one else would go near them. She sat with dying children in Zimbabwe. She traveled to Angola and physically walked, through land that was still potentially mined. to draw attention to the global landmine crisis. That last campaign was the one that truly alarmed certain corners of the British and American governments, because the landmine ban was not simply a humanitarian issue, it was also a deeply political one. The arms industry, which profited enormously from the ongoing manufacture and sale of landmines, had powerful friends in powerful places, and here was Diana, beloved by billions, walking through minefields, speaking directly to heads of state, publicly embarrassing governments that had refused to sign the Ottawa Treaty banning landmines. A senior Conservative MP at the time called her a loose cannon. He said she had no place involving herself in matters of foreign policy. He said it publicly, in the press, without shame. Diana's response was to go back to Angola. She was not intimidated, and that, perhaps more than anything else, tells you who she really was. The divorce was finalized in August 1996. Diana lost the title Her Royal Highness. She was stripped of her rank, but she kept something the palace could never take from her: the love of the people. And she kept something else too, her voice, and she intended to use it. In the months following the divorce, Diana threw herself into humanitarian work with a focus and intensity that surprised even her closest friends. She campaigned against landmines in Angola and Bosnia. She walked through active minefields for the cameras, not for drama, but to make the world watch, to make the world care. She met with dying children in hospitals. She held AIDS patients when the world still feared to touch them. She used her fame like a weapon, aimed it directly at the powerful, and demanded change. And somewhere along the way, she began to be perceived as something more dangerous than a divorced princess. She was becoming a political force. The British establishment watched this with growing unease. A source from within royal circles at the time was quoted as saying, "Diana was becoming impossible to manage. She had the ear of governments. She had the attention of the public. She was operating outside of any structure that could contain her." Contain her. That word again. Now we arrive at the part of this story where the questions multiply, and the answers thin out. By the summer of 1997, Diana had found something she hadn't had in years: happiness. She was spending time with Dodi Fayed, the son of Egyptian billionaire Mohammed Al Fayed, and by all accounts she was genuinely, radiantly happy. Friends described her as lighter than they'd seen her in years. She was laughing, she was sleeping, she was talking about the future. She was also, reportedly, pregnant, and she was also, reportedly, considering converting to Islam, and she was also, reportedly, planning to withdraw from public life in Britain entirely and relocate abroad. Now, none of those things have ever been officially confirmed, but each of them, individually, would have been considered an extraordinary complication for the British establishment. Together, they represented something that certain powerful people may have considered unthinkable. People forget, or perhaps they were never told, just how seriously certain members of the establishment took the idea of Diana building a new life with Dodi. Mohammed Al Fayed, Dodi's father, was not a man the British establishment had ever embraced. Despite living in Britain for decades and contributing enormously to its economy, including purchasing the iconic Harrods department store, his application for British citizenship had been repeatedly and controversially denied. There were those who believed it was racism. There were those who believed it was something more calculated. And now, his son was falling in love with the most famous woman in the world, the mother of the future King of England, a woman whose child would one day sit on the British throne. The idea that Diana might marry Dodi, that she might give birth to a child who would be both a half-sibling to the future king and the child of a Muslim man, that was not a small thing. That was not a thing that certain quarters of the establishment could absorb without alarm. Diana knew this. She had grown up inside that world. She understood its codes. She knew what was acceptable and what was, categorically, not, and she chose Dodi anyway. That choice, that beautiful, defiant human choice, may have cost her everything. On the night of August 30th, 1997, Diana and Dodi dined at the Ritz Hotel in Paris. The paparazzi were everywhere. A pack of photographers had been following them all day, swarming their car, screaming through camera lenses, desperate for the shot. The decision was made to leave through the back of the hotel. Their driver that night was Henri Paul, the acting head of security at the Ritz. He had been drinking. His blood alcohol level was later found to be 3 times the legal limit in France. Why he was chosen to drive Diana and Dodi that night remains to this day unexplained. At 12:23 in the morning, their Mercedes entered the Pont de l'Alma tunnel. Witnesses reported a white Fiat Uno cutting in front of the car. Others reported a blinding flash of light. The car hit the 13th pillar of the tunnel at an estimated 65 miles per hour. Henri Paul and Dodi Fayed died on impact. Diana survived the initial crash. She was breathing when the first responders arrived. She was calling for help. She was conscious enough to know what was happening. It took over an hour to get her to the hospital. 1 hour and 43 minutes to transport a critically injured person to a hospital that was 4 miles away. She died at 4 a.m. She was 36 years old. And now, here is where everything changes. Here is the twist that rewrites the story you thought you knew. Because in the weeks before her death, Diana had written a letter that was given to her butler, Paul Burrell, with instructions that it only be opened in the event of something happening to her. In that letter, Diana wrote these words: "My husband is planning an accident in my car, brake failure, and serious head injury, in order to make the path clear for him to marry." She named Charles. She wrote it down. She put it in an envelope. And she was dead within months. Paul Burrell revealed the letter publicly in 2003, 6 years after her death. The palace denied everything. The official investigations concluded there was no conspiracy. The French inquiry ruled it a tragic accident caused by a drunk driver and the pursuing paparazzi. But the questions never stopped. Why did it take an hour to get Diana to a hospital 4 miles away? Why was Henri Paul, a man with alcohol in his blood, chosen to drive? Who was in the white Fiat Uno that disappeared from the tunnel and was never found? Why had British intelligence service MI6 compiled a dossier on Diana? Why did a former MI6 officer named Richard Tomlinson claim that a plan existed within the intelligence services to assassinate a foreign leader, using a car crash in a tunnel, staged with a blinding flash of light? Every one of those questions has been asked, and every one of them has been officially dismissed. But there is one more thing, one final detail that doesn't appear in most retellings of this story, and yet it may be the most disturbing of all. In the hours after the crash, before Diana had even been formally pronounced dead, before her sons had been woken and told, before the world had been informed, someone made a phone call to the British Embassy in Paris. The call was made to alert officials that something had happened in the tunnel. The identity of the person who made that call has never been established. The content of the call, beyond its basic subject matter, has never been made public, and the timing of it suggests that someone with knowledge of what had happened, or perhaps knowledge of what was supposed to happen, was already in contact with British officials before the public story had even begun to form. That detail was buried. It surfaced briefly during the British inquest into Diana's death. The inquest that concluded in 2008 and returned a verdict of unlawful killing caused by the grossly negligent driving of Henri Paul and the pursuing vehicles. Not murder, not conspiracy, but unlawful killing nonetheless. And the question of who made that phone call was never answered. 3 million people lined the streets of London for Diana's funeral on September 6, 1997. Elton John played a reworked version of Candle in the Wind, and the world wept, not just for the woman they'd lost, but for something they couldn't quite name, a feeling that something had been taken, that the story wasn't over, that the truth was still somewhere out there, locked inside a palace, or buried at the bottom of a file in a government building, or driven away in a white car that was never found. Her 2 sons, William and Harry, walked behind her coffin. William was 15, Harry was 12. They walked in silence, eyes forward, heads down, and Harry would carry what happened in that tunnel for the rest of his life. Years later, he would speak openly about his